Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking an incredibly complex, literally world-shaping challenge, the stalling transition to renewable energy, and breaking it all down into a structured, highly analytical framework. We're going to deconstruct a really groundbreaking academic paper by Dr. Mohammad Nasir Uddin. It introduces something called the Multidimensional Energy Sovereignty Governance Model. We'll just call it MESG. If you've ever looked at global climate agreements and felt like they just aren't moving the needle fast enough, well, this explainer is going to show you exactly why that is, and way more importantly, how we can actually fix it.
Let's kick things off with a contradiction that honestly should stop you right in your tracks. $7 trillion. Now, the prevailing narrative out there right now is that renewable energy is completely taking over because solar and battery costs are just plummeting, right? We hear it all the time. Yet, in 2022 alone, the world spent an estimated $7 trillion, which, to put that into perspective, is roughly 7.1% of the entire global GDP, just subsidizing fossil fuels. This single figure absolutely dwarfs all cumulative public investments in renewable infrastructure. I mean, it's wild. So why is this happening? That massive global tension is exactly what we are unpacking today.
To get to the bottom of this, here is our roadmap. We'll be covering the energy transition paradox, redefining energy sovereignty, the 5 MESG components, 3 regional case studies, pathways to implementation, and finally, the geopolitical road ahead. Let's just dive right in.
Our first stop is Section 1, the energy transition paradox. It's time to shatter a pretty widely held misconception about climate action. There is a massive contrast between myth and reality here. The myth is that we suffer from a technological deficit. You know, the idea that we just don't have enough cheap, efficient, renewable tech yet to make the switch. But the reality is actually a profound governance deficit. The global transition isn't stalling because of a lack of solar panels or wind turbines. It's stalling because our global institutions are currently incapable of managing the entrenched market power of fossil fuels. We are dealing with systemic carbon lock-in. This is where national fiscal architectures, basically how a country funds itself, are just deeply tied to hydrocarbon revenues. Single-level approaches like throwing down an isolated national carbon tax simply cannot overcome a systemic lock-in like that.
So if the core problem is governance, we really need to rethink our definitions. And that brings us to Section 2, redefining energy sovereignty.
The absolute crucial point here is how we define the term energy sovereignty. Historically, we've thought of it as national autarky, meaning a state has total, isolated control over its own resources. It's often treated as this fixed, zero-sum game. You either have it or you don't. But Dr. Uddin's model reconceptualizes this completely into something called stratified relational capacity, or SRC. Basically, this means sovereignty is actually dynamic and relational. Paradoxically, and this is the real lightbulb moment, participating in global governance doesn't diminish a nation's sovereignty. Instead, it actually enhances their effective capacity by giving them access to global institutional resources, technology transfers, and diplomatic leverage that they just wouldn't have on their own. It's like realizing that joining a team actually makes you stronger, not weaker.
Now that we have that foundational theory down, let's move right into Section 3, the 5 MSG components, to see how this builds into actionable solutions.
The Multidimensional Energy Sovereignty Governance Framework is a polycentric institutional design. What that means is it moves far beyond treating decarbonization as just some technical math problem to optimize, which, let's be honest, is what most current models do. Instead, it provides a highly integrative architecture to navigate the messy stuff: geopolitical dependencies, socioeconomic fallout, and climate justice.
I know, these sound like intimidating, highly academic terms, but let's take a quick second to unpack them because they really do provide a brilliant blueprint. First up, the Energy Sovereignty Audit, or ESA. Think of this as the ultimate diagnostic reality check. It maps out a nation's actual, on-the-ground governance capacities and bottlenecks. Second, we have the Scalar Governance Bridge. This acts as the crucial link, connecting local, subnational innovations directly up to global regulatory regimes. That way, a good local idea can actually successfully scale up globally. Third is the Fossil Fuel Decoupling Compact. This tackles the absolute hardest part of the political economy, figuring out how to properly manage subsidy reform and stranded assets without completely collapsing regional economies in the process. Fourth is the Renewable Integration Authority. Think of this as the engine room. It specifically manages intellectual property and vital technology transfers between nations. And fifth, the Energy Justice Adjudication Mechanism. This systematically addresses the real-world socioeconomic costs of the transition for vulnerable communities, ensuring they aren't just treated as an afterthought in high-level global policy. So, how do all these tools actually work together? Through a recursive cycle. The framework doesn't just push top-down mandates from some global headquarters. It starts with the diagnostic phase using that audit we just talked about. Then it moves into a negotiation phase, creating differentiated agreements based on what a country can actually handle. Finally, the integration phase deploys a renewable tech and manages the justice disputes. But crucially, the results of this integration feed dynamically back into the diagnostics. It's a continuous, evolving loop of institutional learning across every single level of governance.
To really grasp how this plays out in the real world, we need to shift to some procedural realism. Let's look at Section 4, 3 regional case studies.
Our first case study is the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC. The MSG audit identifies a truly fascinating paradox here. These states possess some of the highest solar irradiance in the world, not to mention massive financial capital to fund mega projects. Their technological capacity is, quite frankly, phenomenal. And yet their governance architectures remain structurally trapped in fossil fuel optimization. They are under what can only be described as intense existential pressure because their entire social contracts and sovereign wealth depend heavily on hydrocarbons. Applying the framework here wouldn't mean imposing some strict external mandate. It would mean creating a regional compact to collectively manage revenue reallocation and coordinate geopolitical shifts without threatening their fundamental sovereignty.
Now let's compare that to our second case, ASEAN. Unlike the Gulf, ASEAN represents extreme heterogeneity. I mean, you have Singapore's incredibly advanced green finance ecosystem operating right side by side with Myanmar's deep energy governance fragility. The problem here isn't a singular reliance on oil, it's what the author calls governance fragmentation amplification. We see brilliant subnational innovations like Vietnam's super rapid solar deployment, but they remain totally isolated and even create grid challenges. Why? Simply because there's no binding bridge to translate that local success into regional resilience.
Finally, our third case study, the European Union. Now, the EU is globally recognized for its institutional sophistication. Things like the emissions trading system are world-class. But applying our framework reveals some critical vulnerabilities. Notably, the EU suffers from an external energy sovereignty gap. This means despite having great internal markets, they are still highly vulnerable to external geopolitical coercion. Just think about the recent natural gas supply shocks. They also face scalar incoherence. This is basically where high-level climate goals are completely misaligned with the on-the-ground reality of coal-dependent member states like Poland. The framework points directly to the need for better justice adjudication mechanisms to manage this internal friction.
So, the gaps are pretty clear across the board. The question is, how do we actually fix them? That brings us to Section 5. Pathways to implementation.
The model escapes that boring textbook abstraction by offering 3 highly adaptable pathways to actually get this done. Because effective governance isn't a one-size-fits-all mandate. It relies on differentiated institutional scaffolding. First, the regional compacting pathway. This is perfect for areas like the GCC and ASEAN, expanding the mandate of the regional bodies that already exist there. Second, the treaty-anchored pathway. This is for the massive global stage, embedding these new components into existing frameworks like the UNFCCC. And third, the polycentric emergence pathway. This one is really interesting. It's designed for highly contested geopolitical regions where top-down design is just completely impossible. It relies instead on networks of municipal compacts and cross-border investments. Think city-to-city green energy agreements, to organically build robust governance from the ground up.
As we prepare to wrap up, let's step into our final Section 6, the geopolitical road ahead, and synthesize these big dynamics.
From a policy perspective, the implications of all of this are absolutely profound. We really have to challenge the conventional defensive framing of geopolitics. Right now, the energy transition is often viewed as a direct threat to hydrocarbon-dependent nations. But the evidence suggests that strategic fossil fuel decoupling is not a zero-sum game. Under the right governance architecture, hydrocarbon-dependent states can actually leverage their immense wealth and infrastructure to strategically anchor the new renewable economy. It is genuinely fascinating to see how historical oil wealth can be used to aggressively drive a green transition. And we're already seeing glimpses of this proactive governance with massive initiatives like Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 or the UAE's huge investments in hydrogen.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps most important question for you to consider. Think about the energy strategy where you live. Is your nation treating decarbonization as a zero-sum defensive game? Or are they proactively building that stratified relational capacity we talked about, collaborating across scales to secure genuine energy sovereignty for the future?
Because at the end of the day, the transition away from fossil fuels isn't just about building better solar panels. It's about fundamentally rewriting how power, resources, and justice are governed on a global scale. Hopefully this framework has equipped you with a fresh paradigm to view these massive global shifts. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these crucial governance dynamics